Section 17 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 1, The Old Pagan Civilizations. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. Beacon Lights of History, Volume 1, The Old Pagan Civilizations, by John Lord. Literary Genius, Part 2. In didactic poetry Lucretius was preeminent, and is regarded by Schlegel as the first of Roman poets in native genius. He was born 95 B.C. and died at the age of 42 by his own hand. His principal poem, De Rerum Natura, is a delineation of the Epicurean philosophy, and treats of all the great subjects of thought with which his age was conversant. Somewhat resembling Pope's Essay on Man in style and subject, it is immeasurably superior in political genius. It is a lengthened disquisition, in 7,400 lines, upon the great phenomena of the outward world. As a painter and worshipper of nature, Lucretius was superior to all the poets of antiquity. His skill in presenting abstruse speculations is marvellous, and his outbursts of poetic genius are matchless in power and beauty. Into all subjects he casts a fearless eye, and writes with sustained enthusiasm. But he was not fully appreciated by his countrymen, although no other poet has so fully brought out the power of the Latin language. Professor Ramsay, while alluding to the melancholy tenderness of Tibullus, the exquisite ingenuity of Ovid, the inimitable felicity and taste of Horace, the gentleness and splendor of Virgil, and the vehement declamation of Juvenal, thinks that had the verse of Lucretius perished, we should never have known that Latin could give utterance to the grandest conceptions, with all that self-sustained majesty and harmonious swell in which the Grecian muse rolls forth her loftiest outpourings. The eulogium of the Ovid is: Carmina sublimis tunc sunt peritura Lucreti, exitio terras cum dabit una dies. Elegiac poetry has an honorable place in Roman literature. To this school belongs Ovid, born 43 B.C., died 18 A.D., whose Tristia, a doleful description of the evils of exile, were much admired by the Romans. His most famous work was Metamorphoses, mythologic legends involving transformations, a most poetical and imaginative production. He, with that self-conscious genius common to poets, declares that his poem would be proof against sword, fire, thunder, and time, a prediction, says Bayle, which has not yet proved false. Niebuhr thinks that Ovid, next to Catullus, was the most poetical of his countrymen. Milton thinks he might have surpassed Virgil had he attempted epic poetry. He was nearest to the romantic school of all the classical authors, and Chaucer, Ariosto, and Spenser owe to him great obligations. Like Pope, his verses flowed spontaneously. His Tristia were more highly praised than his Amores or his Metamorphoses, a fact which shows that contemporaries are not always the best judges of real merit. His poems, great as was their genius, are deficient in the severe taste which marked the Greeks, and are immoral in their tendency. He had great advantages, but was banished by Augustus for his description of licentious love. Nor did he support exile with dignity. He languished like Cicero when doomed to a similar fate, and died of a broken heart. But few intellectual men have ever been able to live at a distance from the scene of their glories, and without the stimulus of high society. Chrysostom is one of the few exceptions. Ovid, as an immoral writer, was justly punished. Tibullus, also a famous elegiac poet, was born the same year as Ovid, and was the friend of the poet Horace. He lived in retirement, and was both gentle and amiable. At his beautiful country seat he soothed his soul with the charms of literature and the simple pleasures of the country. Niebuhr pronounces the elegies of Tibullus to be doleful, but Merivale thinks that the tone of tender melancholy in which he sung his unprosperous loves had a deeper and purer source than the caprices of 3 inconstant paramours. His spirit is eminently religious, though it bids him fold his hands in resignation rather than open them in hope. He alone of all the great poets of his day remained undazzled by the glitter of the Caesarean usurpation, and pined away in unavailing despondency while beholding the subjugation of his country. Propertius, the contemporary of Tibullus, born 51 B.C., was on the contrary the most eager of all the flatterers of Augustus, a man of wit and pleasure, whose object of idolatry was Cynthia, a poetess and a courtesan. He was an imitator of the Greeks, but had a great contemporary fame. He showed much warmth of passion, but never soared into the sublime heights of poetry like his rival. Such were among the great elegiac poets of Rome, who were generally devoted to the delineation of the passion of love. The older English poets resembled them in this respect, but none of them have risen to such lofty heights as the later ones, for instance, Wordsworth and Tennyson. It is in lyric poetry that the moderns have chiefly excelled the ancients, in variety, in elevation of sentiment, and in imagination. The grandeur and originality of the ancients were displayed rather in epic and dramatic poetry. In satire the Romans transcended both the Greeks and the moderns. Satire arose with Lucilius, 148 B.C., in the time of Marius, an age when freedom of speech was tolerated. Horace was the first to gain immortality in this department. Next Persius comes, born 34 A.D., the friend of Lucian and Seneca in the time of Nero, who painted the vices of his age as it was passing to that degradation which marked the reign of Domitian, when Juvenal appeared. The latter, disdaining fear, boldly set forth the abominations of the times, and struck without distinction all who departed from duty and conscience. There is nothing in any language which equals the fire, the intensity, and the bitterness of Juvenal, not even the invectives of Swift and Pope. But he flourished during the decline of literature, and had neither the taste nor the elegance of the Augustan writers. He was born 60 A.D., the son of a freedman, and was the contemporary of Martial. He was banished by Domitian on account of a lampoon against a favorite dancer, but under the reign of Nerva he returned to Rome, and the imperial tyranny was the subject of his bitterest denunciation next to the degradation of public morals. His great rival in satire was Horace, who laughed at follies, but Juvenal, more austere, exaggerated and denounced them. His sarcasms on women have never been equaled in severity, and we cannot but hope that they were unjust. From an historical point of view, as a delineation of the manners of his age, his satires are priceless, even like the epigrams of Martial. This uncompromising poet, not pliant and easy like Horace, animadverted like an incorruptible censor on the vices which were undermining the moral health and preparing the way for violence, on the hypocrisy of philosophers and the cruelty of tyrants, on the frivolity of women and the debauchery of men. He discoursed on the vanity of human wishes with the moral wisdom of Dr. Johnson, and urged self-improvement like Socrates and Epictetus. I might speak of other celebrated poets, of Lucan, of Martial, of Petronius, but I only wish to show that the great poets of antiquity, both Greek and Roman, have never been surpassed in genius, in taste, and in art, and that few were ever more honored in their lifetime by appreciating admirers, showing the advanced state of civilization which was reached in those classic countries in everything pertaining to the realm of thought and art. The genius of the ancients was displayed in prose composition as well as in poetry, although perfection was not so soon attained. The poets were the great creators of the languages of antiquity. It was not until they had produced their immortal works that the languages were sufficiently softened and refined to admit of great beauty in prose. But prose requires art as well as poetry. There is an artistic rhythm in the writings of the classical authors, like those of Cicero, Herodotus, and Thucydides, as marked as in the beautiful measure of Homer and Virgil. Plato did not write poetry, but his prose is as musical as Apollo's lyre. Burke and Macaulay are as great artists in style as Tennyson himself. And it is seldom that men, either in ancient or modern times, have been distinguished for both kinds of composition, although Voltaire, Schiller, Milton, Swift, and Scott are among the exceptions. Cicero, the greatest prose writer of antiquity, produced in poetry only a single inferior work, which was laughed at by his contemporaries. Bacon, with all his affluence of thought, vigor of imagination, and command of language, could not write poetry any easier than Pope could write prose, although it is asserted by some modern writers of no great reputation that Bacon wrote Shakespeare's plays. All sorts of prose compositions were carried to perfection both by Greeks and Romans in history, in criticism, in philosophy, in oratory, in epistles. The earliest great prose writer among the Greeks was Herodotus, 484 B.C., from which we may infer that history was the first form of prose composition to attain development. But Herodotus was not born until Aeschylus had gained a prize for tragedy, nor for more than 200 years after Simonides, the lyric poet, nourished, and probably 500 or 600 years after Homer sang his immortal epics. Yet though 2000 years and more have passed since he wrote, the style of this great "father of history" is admired by every critic, while his history as a work of art is still a study and a marvel. It is difficult to understand why no work in prose anterior to Herodotus is worthy of note, since the Greeks had attained a high civilization 200 years before he appeared, and the language had reached a high point of development under Homer for more than 500 years. The history of Herodotus was probably written in the decline of life, when his mind was enriched with great attainments in all the varied learning of his age, and when he had conversed with most of the celebrated men of the various countries he had visited. It pertains chiefly to the wars of the Greeks with the Persians; but in his frequent episodes, which do not impair the unity of the work, he is led to speak of the manners and customs of the Oriental nations. It was once the fashion to speak of Herodotus as a credulous man, who embodied the most improbable though interesting stories. But now it is believed that no historian was ever more profound, conscientious, and careful, and all modern investigations confirm his sagacity and impartiality. He was one of the most accomplished men of antiquity, or of any age, an enlightened and curious traveller, a profound thinker, a man of universal knowledge, familiar with the whole range of literature, art, and science in his day, acquainted with all the great men of Greece and at the court of the Asiatic princes, the friend of Sophocles, of Pericles, of Thucydides, of Aspasia, of Socrates, of Damon, of Zeno, of Phidias, of Protagoras, of Euripides, of Polygnotus, of Anaxagoras, of Xenophon, of Alcibiades, of Lysias, of Aristophanes, the most brilliant constellation of men of genius who were ever found together within the walls of a Grecian city, respected and admired by these great lights, all of whom were inferior to him in knowledge. Thus he was fitted for his task by travel, by study, and by intercourse with the great, to say nothing of his original genius. The greatest prose work which had yet appeared in Greece was produced by Herodotus, a prose epic, severe in taste, perfect in unity, rich in moral wisdom, charming in style, religious in spirit, grand in subject, without a coarse passage, simple, unaffected, and beautiful, like the narratives of the Bible, amusing yet instructive, easy to understand, yet extending to the utmost boundaries of human research, a model for all subsequent historians. So highly was this historic composition valued by the Athenians when their city was at the height of its splendor, that they decreed to its author 10 talents (about $12,000) for reciting it. He even went from city to city, a sort of prose rhapsodist, or, like a modern lecturer, reciting his history, an honored and extraordinary man, a sort of Humboldt, having mastered everything. And he wrote, not for fame, but to communicate the results of inquiries made to satisfy his craving for knowledge, which he obtained by personal investigation at Dodona, at Delphi, at Samos, at Athens, at Corinth, at Thebes, at Tyre. He even travelled into Egypt, Scythia, Asia Minor, Palestine, Babylonia, Italy, and to the islands of the sea. His episode on Egypt is worth more, from a historical point of view, than all things combined which have descended to us from antiquity. Herodotus was the first to give dignity to history, nor in truthfulness, candor, and impartiality has he ever been surpassed. His very simplicity of style is a proof of his transcendent art, even as it is the evidence of his severity of taste. The translation of this great history by Rawlinson, with notes, is invaluable. To Thucydides, as a historian, the modern world also assigns a proud preeminence. He was born 471 B.C., and lived 20 years in exile on account of a military failure. He treated only of a short period, during the Peloponnesian War, but the various facts connected with that great event could be known only by the most minute and careful inquiries. He devoted 27 years to the composition of his narrative, and weighed his evidence with the most scrupulous care. His style has not the fascination of Herodotus, but it is more concise. In a single volume Thucydides relates what could scarcely be compressed into 8 volumes of a modern history. As a work of art, of its kind it is unrivalled. In his description of the plague of Athens, this writer is as minute as he is simple. He abounds with rich moral reflections, and has a keen perception of human character. His pictures are striking and tragic. He is vigorous and intense, and every word he uses has a meaning, but some of his sentences are not always easily understood. One of the greatest tributes which can be paid to him is the estimate of an able critic, George Long, that we have a more exact history of a protracted and eventful period by Thucydides than we have of any period in modern history equally extended and eventful, and all this is compressed into a volume. Xenophon is the last of the trio of the Greek historians whose writings are classic and inimitable. He was born probably about 444 B.C. He is characterized by great simplicity and absence of affectation. His Anabasis, in which he describes the expedition of the younger Cyrus and the retreat of the 10,000 Greeks, is his most famous book. But his Cryopædia, in which the history of Cyrus is the subject, although still used as a classic in colleges for the beauty of its style, has no value as a history, since the author merely adopted the current stories of his hero without sufficient investigation. Xenophon wrote a variety of treatises and dialogues, but his Memorabilia of Socrates is the most valuable. All antiquity and all modern writers unite in ascribing to Xenophon great merit as a writer and great moral elevation as a man. If we pass from the Greek to the Latin historians, to those who were as famous as the Greek, and whose merit has scarcely been transcended in our modern times, if indeed it has been equalled, the great names of Sallust, of Caesar, of Livy, of Tacitus rise up before us, together with a host of other names we have not room or disposition to present, since we only aim to show that the ancients were at least our equals in this great department of prose composition. The first great masters of the Greek language in prose were the historians, so far as we can judge by the writings that have descended to us, although it is probable that the orators may have shaped the language before then, and given it flexibility and refinement. The first great prose writers of Rome were the orators, nor was the Latin language fully developed and polished until Cicero appeared. But we do not here write a history of the language; we speak only of those who wrote immortal works in the various departments of learning. As Herodotus did not arise until the Greek language had been already formed by the poets, so no great prose writer appeared among the Romans for a considerable time after Plautus, Terence, Ennius, and Lucretius flourished. The first great historian was Sallust, the contemporary of Cicero, born 86 B.C., the year that Marius died. Q. Fabius Pictor, M. Porcius Cato, and L. Cal Piso had already written works which are mentioned with respect by Latin authors, but they were mere annalists or antiquarians, like the chroniclers of the Middle Ages, and had no claim as artists. Sallust made Thucydides his model, but fell below him in genius and elevated sentiment. He was born a plebeian, and rose to distinction by his talents, but was ejected from the Senate for his profligacy. Afterward he made a great fortune as praetor and governor of Numidia, and lived in magnificence on the perennial, one of the most profligate of the literary men of antiquity. We possess but a small portion of his works, but the fragments which have come down to us show peculiar merit. He sought to penetrate the human heart, and to reveal the secret motives which actuate the conduct of men. The style of Sallust is brilliant, but his art is always apparent. He is clear and lively, but rhetorical. Like Voltaire, who inaugurated modern history, Sallust thought more of style than of accuracy as to facts. He was a party man, and never soared beyond his party. He aped the moralist, but exalted egoism and love of pleasure into proper springs of action, and honored talent disconnected with virtue. Like Carlyle, Sallust exalted strong men, and because they were strong. He was not comprehensive like Cicero, or philosophical like Thucydides, although he affected philosophy as he did morality. He was the first who deviated from the strict narratives of events, and also introduced much rhetorical declamation, which he puts into the mouths of his heroes. He wrote for éclat. Julius Caesar, born 100 or 102 B.C., as an historian ranks higher than Sallust, and no Roman ever wrote purer Latin. Yet his historical works, however great their merit, but feebly represent the transcendent genius of the most august name of antiquity. He was mathematician, architect, poet, philologist, orator, jurist, general, statesman, and imperator. In eloquence he was second only to Cicero. The great value of Caesar's history is in the sketches of the productions, the manners, the customs, and the political conditions of Gaul, Britain, and Germany. His observations on military science, on the operation of sieges and the construction of bridges and military engines are valuable, but the description of his military career is only a studied apology for his crimes, even as the bulletins of Napoleon were set forth to show his victories in the most favorable light. Caesar's fame rests on his victories and successes as a statesman rather than on his merits as a historian, even as Louis Napoleon will live in history for his deeds rather than as the apologist of his great usurping prototype. Caesar's commentaries resemble the history of Herodotus more than any other Latin production, at least in style. They are simple and unaffected, precise and elegant, plain and without pretension. The Augustan age which followed, though it produced a constellation of poets who shed glory upon the throne before which they prostrated themselves in abject homage, like the courtiers of Louis XIV., was still unfavorable to prose composition, to history as well as eloquence. Of the historians of that age, Livy, born 59 B.C., is the only one whose writings are known to us in the shape of some fragments of his history. He was a man of distinction at court, and had a great literary reputation, so great that a Spaniard travelled from Cadiz on purpose to see him. Most of the great historians of the world have occupied places of honor and rank, which were given to them not as prizes for literary success, but for the experience, knowledge, and culture which the high social position and ample means secure. Herodotus lived in courts. Thucydides was a great general, as was Xenophon. Caesar was the first man of his times. Sallust was praetor and governor. Livy was tutor to Claudius. Tacitus was praetor in council. Eusebius was bishop and favorite of Constantine. Ammianus was the friend of the Emperor Julian. Gregory of Tours was one of the leading prelates of the West. Froissart attended in person, as a man of rank, the military expeditions of his day. Clarendon was Lord Chancellor. Burnet was a bishop and favorite of William III. Thiers and Guizot both were the prime ministers, while Gibbon, Hume, Robertson, Macaulay, Grote, Milman, Froude, Neander, Niebuhr, Müller, Dahlmann, Buckle, Prescott, Irving, Bancroft, Motley have all been men of wealth or position. Nor do I remember a single illustrious historian who has been poor and neglected. The ancients regarded Livy as the greatest of historians, an opinion not endorsed by modern critics on account of his inaccuracies. But his narrative is always interesting and his language pure. He did not sift evidence like Grote or generalize like Gibbon, but like Voltaire and Macaulay he was an artist in style and possessed undoubted genius. His annals are comprised in 142 books, extending from the foundation of the city to the death of Drusius, 9 B.C., of which only 35 have come down to us, an impressive commentary on the vandalism of the Middle Ages and the ignorance of the monks who could not preserve so great a treasure. His story flows in a calm, clear, sparkling current, with every charm which simplicity and ease can give. He delineates character with great clearness and power. His speeches are noble rhetorical compositions. His sentences are rhythmical cadences. Livy was not a critical historian like Herodotus, for he took his materials second hand, and was ignorant of geography. Nor did he write with the exalted ideal of Thucydides, but as a painter of beautiful forms which only a rich imagination could conjure, he was unrivalled in the history of literature. Moreover, he was honest and sound in heart, and was just and impartial in reference to those facts with which he was conversant. In the estimation of modern critics, the highest rank as a historian is assigned to Tacitus, and it would indeed be difficult to find his superior in any age or country. He was born 57 A.D., about 43 years after the death of Augustus. He belonged to the equestrian rank, and was a man of consular dignity. He had every facility for literary labors that leisure, wealth, friends, and social position could give, and lived under a reign when truth might be told. The extant works of this great writer are the Life of Agricola, his father-in-law, and his Annales, which begin with the death of Augustus, 14 A.D., and close with the death of Nero, 68 A.D. The Historiae, which comprise the period from the second consulate of Galba, 68 A.D., to the death of Domitian, and a treatise on the Germans. His histories describe Rome in the fullness of imperial glory, when the will of one man was the supreme law of the empire. He also wrote of events that occurred when liberty had fled, and the yoke of despotism was nearly insupportable. He describes a period of great moral degradation, nor does he hesitate to lift the veil of hypocrisy in which his generation had wrapped itself. He fearlessly exposes the cruelties and iniquities of the early emperors, and writes with judicial impartiality respecting all the great characters he describes. No ancient writer shows great moral dignity and integrity of purpose than Tacitus. In point of artistic unity he is superior to Livy and equal to Thucydides, whom he resembles in conciseness of style. His distinguishing excellence as a historian is his sagacity and impartiality. Nothing escapes his penetrating eye, and he inflicts merited chastisement on the tyrants who revelled in the prostrated liberties of his country, while he immortalizes those few who were faithful to duty and conscience in a degenerate age. But the writings of Tacitus were not so popular as those of Livy, since neither princes nor people relished his intellectual independence and moral elevation. He does not satisfy Dr. Arnold, who thinks he ought to have been better versed in the history of the Jews, and who dislikes his speeches because they were fictitious. Neither the Latin nor Greek historians are admired by those dry critics who seek to give rare antiquarian matter a disproportionate importance, and to make this matter as fixed and certain as the truths of natural science. History can never be other than an approximation to the truth, even when it relates to the events and characters of its own age. History does not give positive, indisputable knowledge. We know that Caesar was ambitious, but we do not know whether he was more or less so than Pompey, nor do we know how far he was justified in his usurpation. A great history must have other merits besides accuracy, antiquarian research, and the presentation of authorities and notes. It must be a work of art, and art has reference to style and language, to grouping of details and richness of illustration, to eloquence and poetry and beauty. A dry history, however learned, will never be read. It will only be consulted, like a law book or Mosheim's commentaries. We require life in history, and it is for their vividness that the writings of Livy and Tacitus will be perpetuated. Voltaire and Schiller have no great merit as historians in a technical sense, but the Life of Charles XII and the 30 Years' War are still classics. Neander has written one of the most searching and recondite histories of modern times, but it is too dry, too deficient in art, to be cherished, and may pass away like the voluminous writings of Varro, the most learned of the Romans. It is the art which is immortal in a book, not the knowledge, nor even the thoughts. What keeps alive the provincial letters of Pascal? It is the style, the irony, the elegance that characterize them, the exquisite delineation of character, the moral wisdom, the purity and force of language, the artistic arrangement, and the lively and interesting narrative appealing to all minds, like the Arabian Nights or Froissart's Chronicles, are the elements which give immortality to the classic authors. We will not let them perish, because they amuse, interest, and inspire us. A remarkable example is that of Plutarch, who, although born a Greek and writing in the Greek language, was a contemporary of Tacitus, lived long in Rome, and was one of the immortals of the imperial age. A teacher of philosophy during his early manhood, he spent his last years as an archon and priest of Apollo in his native town. His most famous work is his parallel lives of 46 historic Greek and Romans, arranged in pairs, depicted with marvelous art and all the fascination of anecdote and social wit, while presenting such clear conceptions of characters and careers, and the whole so restrained within the bounds of good taste and harmonious proportion, as to have been even to this day regarded as forming a model for the ideal biography. But it is taking a narrow view of history to make all writers after the same pattern, even as it would be bigoted to make all Christians belong to the same sect. Some will be remarkable for style, others for learning, and others again for moral and philosophical wisdom. Some will be minute, and others generalizing. Some will dig out a multiplicity of facts without apparent object, and others induce from those facts. Some will make essays, and others chronicles. We have need of all styles and all kinds of excellence. A great and original thinker may not have the time or opportunity or taste for a minute and searching criticism of original authorities, but he may be able to generalize previously established facts, so as to draw most valuable moral instruction from them for the benefit of his readers. History is a boundless field of inquiry; no man can master it all in its departments and periods. It will not do to lay great emphasis on minute details, and neglect the art of generalization. If an historian attempts to embody too much learning, he is likely to be deficient in originality. If he would say everything, he is apt to be dry. If he elaborates too much, he loses animation. Moreover, different classes of readers require different kinds and styles of histories. There must be histories for students, histories for old men, histories for young men, histories to amuse, and histories to instruct. If all men were to write history according to Dr. Arnold's views, we should have histories of interest only to classical scholars. The ancient historians never quoted their sources of knowledge, but were valued for their richness of thoughts and artistic beauty of style. The ages in which they flourished attached no value to pedantic displays of learning paraded in footnotes. Thus the great historians whom I have mentioned, both Greek and Latin, have few equals and no superiors in our times in those things that are most to be admired. They were not pedants, but men of immense genius and genuine learning, who blended the profoundest principles of moral wisdom with the most fascinating narrative; men universally popular among learned and unlearned, great artists in style, and masters of the language in which they wrote. Rome can boast of no greater historian after Tacitus, who should have belonged to the Ciceronian epoch. Suetonius, born about the year 70 A.D., shortly after Nero's death, was rather a biographer than an historian, nor as a biographer does he take a high rank. His Lives of the Caesars, like Diogenes Laertius's Lives of the Philosophers, are rather anecdotal than historical. L. Aeneas Florus, who flourished during the reign of Trajan, has left a series of sketches of the different wars from the days of Romulus to those of Augustus. Frontinus epitomized the large histories of Pompeius; Anamius Marcellinus wrote a history from Nerva to Valens, and is often quoted by Gibbon; but none wrote who should be adduced as examples of the triumph of genius except Sallust, Caesar, Livy, Plutarch, and Tacitus. Section 18.